All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to make the invisible, well, visible. We're going to break down the fundamental forces that control every single move your body makes, from something as small as a blink to an all-out sprint. Let's get to it.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. Every single time you take a step, a force that's multiple times your own body weight is just slamming through your joints. So how come you don't just, crumble? The answer is all in this beautiful, complex dance of biomechanics.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this explainer. We are going to make those invisible forces totally clear. We're going to strip away all the complexity and just look at the core principles one by one, so you can really see how the human body is this incredible moving machine.
Okay, so we're going to start with the most intuitive type of force there is, a pull. This is really the foundation of how our muscles move our skeleton around, and it all comes down to a concept called tension.
A tensile force is, well, it's just a fancy term for a pulling force. I want you to picture a game of tug-of-war. The force the two teams are putting on the rope, that's a tensile force. And that feeling of tautness inside the rope, that's tension. Our bodies are just filled with these biological ropes that work on this exact same principle.
And this diagram here shows that idea perfectly. Think of that ligament in the middle as the rope from our tug-of-war. The arrows, those are the forces pulling the tissue apart right along its axis. That internal resistance it has to being stretched, that's what we call tension.
So why do you need to know this? Because our most important tissues are literally designed for it. Your ligaments, they act like guide wires, resisting tension to keep your joints stable. Tendons are the transmission cables. They use tension to turn a muscle's contraction into actual movement of a bone. And your joint capsules, they feel that tension at the very end of your range of motion, which is what tells you, hey, don't go any further. But here is a super important point. Forces never ever act alone. Thanks to Newton's third law, we know that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when that tendon pulls on a bone, that bone is pulling back on the tendon with the exact same amount of force. It's a two-way street, and you really have to grasp this to understand everything that comes next.
Okay, so let's take that idea and see what happens when we apply these pulling forces specifically to our joints. This brings us to a couple of new ideas: distraction and stability.
So, when a pulling force starts to separate the surfaces of a joint, we call that joint distraction. This makes the ligaments go a bit slack and allows for a little bit of joint play. But the body has this amazing defense mechanism called the closed packed position. This is where the joint surfaces have maximum contact and the ligaments are pulled super taut. In this position, the joint becomes incredibly stable and can resist those very same distraction forces.
You actually feel distraction forces all the time. Just carrying a heavy suitcase, right? That downward pull creates a distraction force on your shoulder. And in the clinic, therapists use this on purpose. Manual traction is just applying a very controlled distraction force to a joint, usually to relieve some pressure or maybe to improve mobility.
All right, let's flip the script. Instead of pulling joints apart, what about the forces that are pushing them together? This is where we get into compression and the incredibly important internal reaction forces that, keep us from collapsing into a heap. So first, we have joint compression. That's any external force that's squeezing a joint. But the really cool part is that the body generates its own force in response. We call this the joint reaction force, or JRF. This is the force between the joint surfaces that pushes back, stopping us from collapsing under all that load from gravity in our own muscles.
And this diagram just illustrates that concept beautifully. You can see your body weight pushing down on the knee joint. In response, the tibia pushes back up with an equal and opposite joint reaction force. If that internal JRF wasn't there, your knee would just buckle, simple as that. It's this silent internal force that gives us our fundamental stability.
So far, we've mostly been dealing with forces in nice, straight lines, either pulling or pushing. But in the real world, and especially in the human body, forces from muscles rarely act in a perfect straight line. So to really understand them, we have to start analyzing more complex systems.
So let's just quickly revisit Newton's law of inertia. It just says that an object's resistance to a change in its motion is proportional to its mass, right? It takes way more force to get a huge boulder moving than it does a little pebble. This same idea applies in a clinical setting. It's going to take more force to get a wheelchair moving with a larger person in it, or for that matter, to move larger body parts compared to smaller ones. Okay, so when a muscle pulls at an angle, its effect isn't just in one direction. To really understand what's happening, we have to break that angled force down into two simpler parts: a vertical component, which we'll call Fy, and a horizontal one, Fx. Usually, one of these is doing the work of rotating the limb while the other is creating compression to help stabilize the joint. So, how do we find out exactly how big those component forces are? Well, we use some basic trigonometry. Now, don't worry about memorizing the formulas right now. The big takeaway here is that these relationships let us precisely calculate how much of that angled muscle pull is actually turning the bone and how much is just stabilizing the joint. It's incredibly useful.
Next up, let's look at a different kind of force. One that doesn't push or pull directly into a surface, but instead acts parallel to it. These are the forces of shear and friction.
A shear force is basically a sliding or a gliding force. A perfect clinical example is the constant anterior shear force on your lower back. Because of the natural curve of your lumbar spine, gravity is always trying to make one vertebra slide forward on top of the one underneath it. And if you have poor posture, that shear stress goes way, way up.
Friction, on the other hand, is the force that resists all that sliding. A healthy joint is an amazing, incredibly low-friction environment. It's lubricated by what's called synovial fluid. But in an osteoarthritic joint, the cartilage starts to wear away, the surfaces get rough, and friction just skyrockets. This huge increase in resistance is a major cause of pain and even more joint damage.
And finally, we get to bring it all together. All of these forces we've been talking about, tension, compression, shear, gravity, they are constantly acting on your body. The state of perfect balance between all of them is what we call equilibrium.
When an object is in equilibrium, it means all the forces acting on it completely cancel each other out. The net force is zero. Now, this doesn't always mean it's standing perfectly still, but it does mean it isn't accelerating. Our body's ability to just maintain a posture is a constant dynamic search for this state of equilibrium.
And this diagram of someone just standing on one leg, it is the perfect summary of everything we've talked about. You've got the downward force of your body weight, you've got the tensile force of the hip abductor muscles pulling up and out to stop your pelvis from dropping, and then you have that massive joint reaction force pushing up and in, balancing everything else out. All the forces right there in perfect balance for simple everyday action.
So these forces, they are always at play. Doesn't matter if you're lifting a heavy weight, correcting a patient's posture, or just walking down the street. So the real question is, now that you can see them, how are you going to use this knowledge to optimize movement and, just as importantly, prevent injury?